Welcome to Adventures in Accessibility, a podcast that explores the far reaches of disability, access, and inclusion, with your host, Emily Schumann.
Welcome back, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Andrew Leland. He's the author of The Country of the Blind, a memoir at the end of sight, which was named Best Book of the Year by The New Yorker, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and others. His writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, McSweeney's Quarterly, and the San Francisco Chronicle, among other outlets. From 2013 to 2019, he hosted and produced The Organist, an arts and culture podcast for KCRW. He has also produced pieces for Radiolab and 99% Invisible. Andrew has been an editor at The Believer since 2003. All right. Hi, Andrew. Thanks so much for being on our podcast. We're really excited to have you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So on your website, you refer to yourself as a writer, audio producer, editor, and teacher of digital storytelling. How did you discover your passion and talents in those areas?
I come from a family of writers on my mom's side, and on my dad's side, I grew up watching him kind of ride the first wave of the desktop publishing revolution, where he was, working for cable TV at the sort of dawn of that era, and then getting into like desktop publishing, desktop videos, when a lot of the tools that people use to, do everything from put out a newsletter to, editing a video started to become cheaper and more easier to use and more widely available. And so I think those two things, kind of my mom's interest in literature and theater, and my dad's interest in media, really, electronic media, in the laboratory, combined to make me someone who was really interested in telling stories, not just like for the stage, but like thinking about new media. So like podcasts. And, I worked for a print magazine for a long time, but also worked for magazines during the period where blogs became a thing, and just thinking, so I've thought a lot about how people tell stories, do nonfiction stories, do journalism across these different media.
Mm-hmm. And what do you do for fun?
I'm going to sound like a real nerd saying this, but these days I've been getting really into learning how to code, which I think is like a natural extension of what I just said. So like, I just find myself super geeked on like learning. It's a little bit like the movie The Matrix, when, you're like, oh, wait, there's like this whole universe that's like underneath all the stuff we use all day. And I sort of knew that in the abstract, but like now that I'm actually kind of like cracking open some of those files and checking them out, it's kind of fascinating. So that's I've been geeking out about that. But I also, love hanging out with my family, and we go walking on the trails and go travel together a lot, exploring restaurants. I love to do that. Recently discovered weightlifting, which I never thought I would do either, but turns out it's super fun.
Yeah. What coding language are you getting into?
I'm starting with Python.
Okay.
And I'm at the very beginning, so don't ask me any hard questions about Python.
I wouldn't know any questions to ask.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm married to one of those geeks, so
okay,
familiar with that a little bit. So, the title of your memoir, of course, foreshadows for listeners that we're talking to someone who's experiencing vision loss, but we know there's lots of different ways that people experience vision loss. Can you tell us a little bit more about your individual situation and kind of how that impacts your day-to-day life?
Yeah. So I'm 43, and I was diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa, or RP, when I was 19. And before that, I had noticed, for years before that, I had noticed night blindness. Like I would, go out to the movies or, go for a night hike or something and just be confused by how much better everyone else was at doing those things. And it was kind of mysterious, like, because I was, for the rest of the day, like at school, I could, see everything. I could play sports without any accommodations. It was like, just somehow at night, it was like I was like a werewolf or something, and things got weird at night. And that went on for long enough that I finally went to a retinal specialist, and they said, "Yep, you've got RP." And the prognosis at that time was that it was going to be this like very gradual decline over years until I hit middle age, and then it would sort of go off a cliff, and I would become blind. And now that I'm sort of at middle age, it's sort of that's both true and not true. So I have somewhere in the range of like, between 5 and 10% of my visual field remaining, depending on which eye you're talking about and what kind of vision you're talking about. But, so like imagine looking through a toilet paper tube, because RP, generally speaking, not always, sort of goes from the outside in. So like your peripheral vision gets narrower and narrower. And the night blindness is because your rod cells in your retina are degenerating. So the rod cells are responsible for low light vision, but they're also responsible for peripheral vision. So the more rod cells I lose, the narrower my field of vision gets and the harder a time I have seeing anything in low light. I don't know how to exactly say where along that journey I am, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about that and talking to other people with RP. But the reality is there's not a cure for RP. So I'm legally blind now, and I've hit maybe the last 10 years, I've hit the point where I'm really starting to embrace blindness skills and blindness tools like a screen reader for my computer and a white cane, heading out anywhere. Those are the two big ones. But at the same time, I can still see a bunch of stuff. And the reality is talking to a lot of other people with degenerative, and RP is one of the most common certainly the most common genetic cause of blindness in the world. There's still a lot of other ways people become blind, different ways to be blind, which is something I found really interesting in researching my book. But anyway, for me, the reality is like I'm blind, but also I can see stuff. And like that might be true in different ways for years to come. So I'm sort of a lot of my time spent wrapping my head around that and figuring out, how to proceed with that reality.
Have you seen those images online that are sort of like retinitis pigmentosa, like simulators?
I have,
examples?
yeah.
Do you find this to be pretty accurate or no?
I mean, I think it's better than nothing in terms of just like trying to get through to somebody like what the experience might be like. I think the risk with those is that, I mean, for one thing, it's not like I say that it's like seeing through a tube, but when you like hold a tube up to your eyes, you're sort of looking at the tube. And RP and the way the brain works is it's not like I'm like conscious of all of the dead space, it's more just like my new vision is this. So I think one of the things the simulators miss, and this is not something I think you can do in a simulator. It's not like I'm blaming the simulator, but like the lived experience of blindness is really, really different than what it is if you just like put a blindfold on or put an RP simulator on. And I think a lot of disabled people have commented on this, that like, just the experience of like, oh, I'm sitting in a wheelchair for like 90 seconds and I'm going to see what that feels like. That's very, very different than trying to like go through your day using a wheelchair. Right. And so I think it kind of falls into that category a little bit, like not always damaging necessarily, but also like if you're trying to find out what it's like to have this condition, I think talking to somebody and thinking about it in a more critical way is probably a better path than wearing a funny pair of glasses.
Yeah, definitely. So what made you decide to start writing about this in that sort of memoir style,
Well, so like I said, it was about 10 years ago that I moved to Massachusetts. And at that time I was carrying a white cane folded up in my bag and almost never using it because I was ashamed of it, because whenever I brought it out, I felt like a fraud. Like people would look at me and be like, that guy's totally blind. And then they would see me, whatever, look at my phone or, look at anything and be like, oh, what a fraud. And I hated that. And I wasn't even sure I needed it, even though I was increasingly like, getting myself into situations where I wish I had it. And so I just made the decision when I moved here that I would just use it wherever I went. I didn't know anybody. So I would just be a guy with a cane and I would just like deal with those feelings. And it was a really good decision. But the other sort of side effect of it was that it really changed the way that I experienced the world. Like people would treat me differently. People would like kind of be more intrusive in public, like kind of grab my elbow and be like, oh, hey, the curb's over here. Like things like that would never happen to me as a non-disabled person. Like it's sort of unimaginable to just like do that to a random person, and yet people see somebody with a disability and like those rules somehow just get rewritten on the spot. And I found that troubling, but I also found it fascinating, just as as somebody who's interested in culture and social relations and just like how people live. I was like, this is weird, what's going on here? And so it was kind of like this dual thing where I felt this really personal need to figure it out, just to figure out like what blindness meant in the broadest sense for me personally, but also this sort of intellectual curiosity about like, there weren't a lot of books. I mean, there's a lot that's been written about the history of blindness, there's like interesting places, but I really hadn't seen the kind of book that I wanted to read, which is the book that I wrote, which is like at once a personal account of the experience of vision loss, but one that is super engaged in history and in politics and in culture and like what's going on beyond the individual experience. So my book is a memoir, but it also goes pretty deeply into a lot of those other realms.
Yeah, you just exactly described what I love so much about it, is that it's both your personal experience, but there's really a lot of education and information and just about disability culture and blind culture and assistive technologies and, a whole world that I don't think people always necessarily get to learn about.
Definitely. Thank you. Yeah, exactly what I was aiming for.
Yeah, and it's so beautifully written. I listened to it this weekend. I listened to the audiobook and I really appreciated that you narrated it yourself.
Thank you.
And, one of the things that I think comes up within the book a lot is just the complexities that you describe about losing your eyesight and then occupying a new identity. What do you wish you had known sooner about disability?
That's a tough question. One thing I wish I'd learned about disability sooner is the ways that it's not a binary, the ways that it's a spectrum. I think I had a really common perception of disability, which is that like you're either blind or you're not. You either have a disability or you don't. Like, and even into the realm of accessibility, this is like maybe that's another kettle of fish, but a website is accessible or it isn't. And the more I kind of look into all this stuff, the more of these gray areas there are. And that doesn't like erase the category of disability. There still is that, like, you still have to draw a line somewhere and define these terms. But the experience of it, like the lived experience of it, is so much more nuanced and complicated. And that goes for the sense of marginalization too. Like, I think I had this very naive sense that like, okay, I'm becoming blind. And like, when I'm blind, then I will be marginalized, full stop. And, one of the big discoveries I made in researching the book was just all the ways that like an intersectional analysis, which is to say like thinking about class and race and gender, really complicate the picture of marginalization with disability, and disability interacts with these other identities in complicated ways. So yeah, I would say the thing that I wish I'd known about disability sooner was how nuanced it is as a category.
Yeah, and I imagine, like with most people who acquire a disability over time, it probably took you some time to identify or resonate with that label. Is that true?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that comes back to the kind of imposter syndrome that I felt and still feel in different scenarios, where I catch myself like I kind of flip flop between two poles. Sometimes I'm happily floating in the middle, but more often I'm like, wow, look how blind I am. Like, I'm blind and I'm on the side of the blind people and I've got my blind brothers and sisters, and I'm like very much in that category.
Mhm.
And other times I'm like, what am I talking about? Like, I'm like watching TV and I don't even have audio description on. Like, I'm using magnification. Like, that's not what blind people do. I'm a faker, and then, increasingly, I think with all this work I'm doing to sort of just like understand it, I can just sort of accept that like, yeah, I'm not totally blind, but yes, I like definitely have a tiny fraction of the amount of sight that most people do. So like, I can be disabled even if I'm like in this in between category. And then, as I was just suggesting, I think it is the majority of disability experience. There are certainly many cases where it's like, okay, inarguably, like, was in a car crash, lost all my sight. Like, yes, you're blind. But I think even in situations like that, people can kind of second guess themselves and get into their own heads about what it is. And then there's also a lot of pressure from the outside, I think, both on the sort of institutional level of like needing to prove to the government, or prove to an employer that you deserve an accommodation or that you are disabled, but also proving to yourself in some ways or to family members. So it can be very tricky. And I say it's an ongoing practice. Like, I'm tempted to be like, wrote the book, thought it through, figured it out. Like, now I accept it. But the reality is that like there are good days and bad days, and days when I like feel confident and days when I'm confused or, being too hard on myself. And I just have to sort of keep on moving forward.
And when did you first encounter the ADA? What did you first learn about it, or how did you first hear about it?
My first encounter with the ADA, I mean, besides a sort of general awareness of it as a piece of legislation that had nothing to do with me, before I felt like I had a disability,
Mm-hmm.
was when I was talking to a lawyer named Dan Goldstein, who for many, many years was one of the main lawyers for the National Federation of the Blind. He just kind of like popped up out of the blue. He saw that I was teaching a class called The Literature of Blindness at Smith College, which I was doing before I wrote the book. And he was like mentoring a blind student at Amherst College and was like, hey, we should get lunch. And it was great. He's cited, but he's, having worked for decades as the lawyer for the National Federation of the Blind, he's brought a lot of really important ADA lawsuits, and it's just been a really nice guide for me. And so it was one of those things where you just like talk to somebody and they're light years ahead of you, but there's like a openness and a generosity to their expertise. And it was like that with Dan, where he was like just very patiently explaining to me, like, well, the ADA, there hadn't been a lawsuit that conceived of a website as a public space that would be protected by the ADA. And so when we sued, I think it was Target, he said there was this idea that like as a blind person going to, target.com to do your shopping, like that is, we argued, the equivalent of like walking into a Target, and you're entitled to the same protections. And so I think that was the beginning of my even just understanding like what public, what it means to be publicly, like what a public space is. And also the beginning of my realization that for blind people, while there are a lot of like built world environmental accessibility challenges, the vast majority, or at least like the juicy stuff that I started with and I'm still really into, is digital accessibility. Because, for blindness, so much of the challenge is access to information, and access to information is happening online.
Yeah. So what is it that, kind of what is your experience with digital accessibility been like?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of alluded to this before, but one of the most interesting things that I've found is that as I've gone through like the real baby steps of going from just like mainstream user, like opening my laptop and looking at a website, to like, oh, okay, if I do like, control plus a bunch of times, all the font gets bigger, to like, what's a screen reader? And now I'm going to have things read things aloud to me, or maybe there's better ways to magnify the text. All of that it's like learning Python, I mean, it's hard. And I mean, it's not hard to go control plus to make the font bigger, but like, you do that on one website, it looks beautiful and you're happy. You do it on another website, all of a sudden, like, it makes all the pictures bigger. And so like, it's just this like blender smoothie of like images and giant letters. And you're like, whoops, guess I can't read that way. And so, I had this really binary sense of accessibility, where I think understandably, like the metaphor or the example that's so clear to so many people, and to me as well, is like the wheelchair ramp, and it's like, does the building have stairs and no ramp? Inaccessible. Like, is there no elevator? Like, fail. Is there an elevator and ramp? Good, you're good to go. But like in those situations, and with digital accessibility, it's like so much more complicated than that, in terms of like, how steep is the ramp, or like, does the elevator not take you to the floor that the bathroom is on? Like, and so I think with digital accessibility, it was the same thing. There's this long period that I'm just now like barely emerging from, where I had to think, am I not getting this because I'm just haven't learned the right keyboard commands for my screen reader, or is this an inaccessible website? And then the other piece of that is, I think I learned this from Josh Mealy, who's a really brilliant blind technologist who works at Amazon. He made the point, come to the same point about the spectrum of accessibility. Like, if you have to hit tab 63 times to get to the checkout button as a screen reader user, technically, as a screen reader user, you can check out and like buy your halogen light bulb or whatever it is you're buying. But having to hit tab 63 times just to do that, that's a deep inconvenience and pretty big barrier. And so at that point, we can call the website inaccessible, even if like technically there is a labeled button buried somewhere between like, 64 tab fields. That helped me too. But so I think that gives you a sense of where I am in my thinking on it.
Have you had the ability to influence some of these very large media outlets that you've worked with, NPR, New Yorker, things like that, about accessibility policies or practices?
Yeah, definitely. And gratefully, I've started writing. I wasn't really publishing in the way that I have been for the last 5 years previously. So, but that time, not coincidentally, I don't think has coincided with a much greater awareness of digital accessibility, especially among some of these bigger media outlets. So, for example, the New York Times, I wrote a story for them in 2019 for the New York Times Magazine about blindness and television. And I was like, you guys, like, the images have to be alt text on them if you're going to publish this. And then they were like, we're about to do this like huge accessibility overhaul. So like, we can't, like, your piece is coming out a little too early for that, but we'll like, they had to do some sort of like manual DIY fix for it. That story had the alt text, but now, and I was a little skeptical, like, is there really an accessibility overhaul happening? Like, or are you just like mollifying me? But now if you go to the New York Times, like, they're one of the best in the industry, I would say, in terms of how much alt text and how smart the alt text is in terms of like being useful and like describing infographics. Yeah. And like, I did a story for Radiolab, and they were like, let's provide a Braille ready file of the transcript of this episode. I was amazed. So, there have been examples where I've had to push, but I've also been really psyched with places like WNYC, New York Times, Vox. When I wrote for Vox, it was just like, it was a cloud nine experience. And I mean, I think part of that was like, I was writing as a part of this disability related package that was guest edited by Alice Wong, who's like one of the most brilliant disability activists alive. And so like, of course, Alice wasn't going to have anything going that wasn't like 100% accessible. So yeah, I've been very lucky, but also I do feel a responsibility whenever I'm writing for somewhere new to just, to do it in a firm but friendly way, to be like, this is how it's got to be if I'm going to be writing for you.
We love to hear it. So what are some of the other accessibility challenges you face? In your memoir, you talk a little bit about attitudes and disability etiquette, if you have things like that.
That bug me. I don't know if this is exactly what your question is asking, but I recently took a class with a guy named Patrick Smith, who runs something called the IOTA School, that I really recommend to anybody interested in digital accessibility. And the class was called Non-Visual Data Science. And this is what got me hooked on the Python thing. And I ended up like geeking out on this guy and like reading his dissertation, and which was all about digital accessibility. And the idea that I've sort of gleaned, and this is not, I'm not quoting him, but I just wanted to give him props because I think like he's a figure who's like really steered my thinking in this direction even more. So for example, let's say I want to make an Excel spreadsheet of all the like home recordings that I make. I'm sort of an audio geek, and like I like to like record my son cooking pancakes or, my dog chasing a squirrel or whatever, and just have like a, little archive of those. And it would be useful to have an Excel spreadsheet of them. And a lot of blind people are in Excel all day, and Excel is accessible. But at the same time, like the way that Excel is accessible is largely through the graphical user interface. Like you're like memorizing, like, okay, if I hit Alt, then I'm in the ribbon. And if I like tab 4 times, I can get to this part of the ribbon. There's a shortcut, but the shortcuts make no sense, right? They're like Alt XCB2. And then, if that's your job, like you can do it. But the thing that Patrick Smith has sort of reoriented me around is like, if you dig a little deeper into how computers work, you can get to a place where it's all plain text. And like for a blind person, and I kind of think for like disabled people in general, there's like a principle where, it's kind of a universal design thing, right? Like the more kind of like drilled down you can be in some ways, like the more accessible it's going to be. And that's not always true. And I'm still just figuring this out. But like, so doing something where there's a little more coding required maybe, and it's a little geekier, but like if you can swing that, you have much more control. And so it's like, am I going to expect the world to build tools with me in mind? Like ideally, yes. But in the reality is like over and over again, we've seen like well-meaning companies make something accessible, then they push an update and then it's no longer accessible. And my motivation for learning code and for like, instead of figuring out this spreadsheet in Excel, I want to figure it out in like plain text editor, and like writing a little script for myself that like could turn it, basically like talk to my computer and say like, okay, where's this audio file? Or like, how many audio files do I have of my dog chasing squirrels and what dates are they? And then it returns that. Same stuff Excel could do. Tell me how many hours total I have of squirrel sounds. All the things that I could do in Excel, I'm doing in this slightly geekier way, but one where I have more control. And so I guess, yeah, the principle here is like, if there's a great disability activism line, like nothing about us without us. And I'm thinking like, if there aren't blind people or disabled people working at a lot of these companies, then, it kind of falls on blind or disabled people to, seize the means of production, right? And like make our own tools. And there's such an interesting history of that I've only scratched the surface of, from like, post polio survivors, like, distributing newsletters about how to hack your wheelchair to do things that it wasn't originally built to do, to like all these blind hackers, hacking the phone lines and building tools for themselves. And so I kind of like, the more blind I become, the more I kind of see myself working in that community of like, okay, I'm going to need to build tools for myself that do this. Otherwise, I'm going to be memorizing keyboard shortcuts for a program that might not be accessible someday anyway.
Wow, that's really interesting. That's not a perspective I think I've really heard very much. It's just the need to have to build your own thing. It just made me think of like AI and like ChatGPT tools,
Yeah.
And whether or not someday you're going to be able to ask ChatGPT, search my computer for all the hours of audio recordings I have.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's there already. I mean, yeah, Google has a tool that does some version of that, and I think it's only going to become greater. I mean, this is definitely more geeky than you want, but it's interesting the way that ChatGPT, for instance, like it's a conversation, right? Like you're like asking it questions and it's returning answers. And I grew up long before I had any sense of blindness being in my life. I was on grown-ups computers in the 80s playing these text-based adventure games like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or Zork, where it's really modeled on how how like the original command line works, where it's like you're in a field and you type like take dog, and it's like you can't take a dog, the dog bites you on the ankle. Those games kind of grew out of the form of computers where it's like there's this whole world and the way you interact with it is through text. And then when the graphical revolution happened, that was really great, and visual computers are really good, but like for blind people maybe not so much. And one thing that I'm sort of getting to with all this new interest that I've got is like learning the command line is returning me back to like the joy of that, like talking to the computer, which looking backwards but also looking forwards, like neural networks and like these large language models are the same thing, where I'm like still chatting at a text prompt and it's giving me access to these huge worlds. So if anything, it gets back to this idea that like, it's not necessarily simplicity, right? Because like these are hugely complicated systems, but there's something about the interface, like a simplicity of the friction point between the human and whatever the human is trying to get, that is really important for accessibility. And part of it has to do with control. Maybe all of it has to do with control. I don't know. You're getting me fired up on ideas that I'm like going to be thinking about for years to come. So I'm at the very beginning of this, but it's exciting.
Maybe this will be the subject of your next book.
I hope so. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in here.
With the recent book, what's been most unexpected for you about the way it was received and has been really acclaimed?
One question that I've gotten a lot is like, did you write the book for blind people or for sighted people? And, my publisher is a commercial publisher, and, there was never any illusion that I was writing it for exclusively a blind audience. And I think one of the more difficult parts of the editorial process was my editor and me having these conversations about like, how universal of a gesture do I need to make? In other words, like I'm writing about this very specific narrow world. You could even say geeky, right? To stay on brand with the theme of our conversation. Like, blindness, it might as well be like a group of, talking about Python programmers or something, right? It's like relatively low incidence. There's a sort of a narrow set of concerns about like what those needs are, what the sort of stories are. And yet I'm trying to tell this story in a way that would appeal to somebody who like doesn't have a blind uncle, doesn't really think about blindness that much. How can I make them interested in it? And so there was this question of like, what are the universal themes here? And I struggled with that because I wanted to be like, no, like there is pleasure and value in the specificity of this. We don't need to find universal themes, but I had to. That was my job, right? Because otherwise, then we're going to publish the book, and so I had to really dig for it. But I think I found them, and if I had to summarize it, it would be this idea of like transition and identity, and like me going through this transition from sightedness to blindness and finding pain and loss in that, but also finding like real value and solidarity and community. And like, as our whole conversation up until this point shows, like, real like intellectual excitement, creative power, and I think that's an experience that you can expand far beyond just blindness or disability. And so I think I was surprised that like people actually bought it, which is not to say like it was like I was like, selling them a bill of goods. Like I believe it, but that felt the riskiest to me. Like, are people really going to feel like there is something universal here? And clearly, for a lot of people, it was.
Yeah, definitely. I think it resonates with a lot of people. And so your paperback has just been released. What does that mean for you? What are your hopes there?
I don't know. I've never been a book author. I get the sense that like, the hardcover is like the big moment where you're trying to introduce it to the world. And I think the paperback, the book already has its own momentum. And so I think it's more just like, hey, here's a more affordable version. I don't really know if there's anything for me to do or say about it. It's just like point to it and give a thumbs up and hope for the best.
Well, now it can be the summer beach read of the year.
Yeah.
And people can pick it up in the airport bookstore, bring it on the plane, right?
Totally. I mean, the funny thing about a paperback is like, I don't read print anymore. And obviously the vast majority of blind people don't either. I mean, there are large print books and, you can like get a e-reader, like a Kindle, basically turn any book into large print that way. But, there's all these libraries for the blind that offer books for free. And so that's the other funny thing that I feel like my publisher didn't quite know. And I definitely didn't tell them, but it's like, I don't know if blind people are really buying that many books, you guys. Like, I think they were imagining a lot of book sales from blind people. But that said, like, I think a blind person will download the free version on, their library for the blind. And then like when they want to give it to their nephew, they'll buy the print version. So yeah, there was one thing that a lot of blind people, not a lot, but like for me, a lot, like I got like 4 or 5 comments about where, and this is just, staying in the theme of the blind geekery. There was this tool called the Opticon, which I've never actually seen one, but it's this little device that you like put on any piece of print. So like you can put it on like a foreign language dictionary that, those early talking, scanners, they could only handle English, for instance, or, put it on a diagram and basically could like in real time convert whatever it was seeing into like a little tactile, like haptic feedback. And so like it allowed blind students who were like taking foreign language classes, to like read Sanskrit, by like feeling the letters, or, see a physics diagram by like passing it over. And I just kind of botched the description of it in the hardcover. Like they were just like, you didn't really explain that in the right way. And it was partially because, like I had never seen one and I was like kind of had secondhand. So the thing I'm most excited about for the paperback is there's a much better description of the Opticon. Improved description of what the heck an Opticon is. One sentence on page 240. There you have it.
Is it like a refreshable braille display? Like, would that be kind of analogous? Or
imagine like a refreshable braille display that's hooked up to a camera, and instead of showing you braille, it shows you like a vibrating, shivering array of pins. And I think it has to be moving to work. The sentence in the book, this is how writing works, is like, you like crystallize your understanding for a minute enough to like get a sentence that's right. And then you can just move on. And now I don't remember. But basically, like as you pass the camera over an image or a piece of text, it like passes that image haptically across your fingers. So kind of like a braille display, but a braille display, you're moving your finger over the braille display. And I feel like this thing, it's sort of like your finger is on it and it's like running these vibrating pins across your finger in a way that as you move the camera, it's like letting you see the shape of letters or diagrams or whatever.
Okay, that clears it up. I think I'm still going to look one up, but I think I've got a better sense of it. It reminds me of, have you seen those things where it's like a bunch of little pins and it's like a kid's toy and you can put your hand in it?
Yes.
It's like got a little geography landscape of your hand.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, the funny thing about Braille and like tactile graphics in general is that I think it's one of those things that like it's hard to wrap your head around, or at least like you have to learn. Unlike an image, like you just look at an image, right? And like your eye will like jump to different parts of an image, but like the image is pretty static and you're just like, I'm staring at a painting, I'm staring at a word on the page. But like tactile doesn't work like that. It requires movement, right? Like you can't just like stick your thumb on a piece of Braille and know what it says. Like you read it by passing it from left to right. And so the Opticon and tactile graphics in general, like they work through movement. And so the confusing thing about the Opticon is that like the movement is happening from the machine rather than your finger moving, but it's the same principle. Like you only see it by the movement of the pins across your finger.
Well, we're going to find a good video of an Opticon and put it in the show notes for everybody.
Brad, that makes me happy. I can probably, if you can't find one, let me know. I've got something I think I can share.
Awesome. Okay. So I just have a couple questions left for you. A question I just like to ask everybody. What would you say to people who are feeling defeated, either because of a personal struggle, current events, whatever the case may be?
It sounds like a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. I think one day at a time is such an important framework. And then, you break that down even more, like one hour at a time, 1 minute at a time, 1 second at a time. And, I grew up learning, both my parents were meditators and, taught me to meditate. And that the practice of meditation is really important to me. And I think the value of it is that sense of like, no matter where you are, no matter what overwhelming situation is confronting you, there's the practice is to just sort of return to the moment, the present moment, which always has some little, even if it's just like a micrometer, microcentimeter worth of wiggle room, like there is some space in that moment to like exist and be calm, even in the midst of like terrible storms. So yeah, I would say have faith in the present moment and break it down when things are overwhelming.
Where would you like listeners to connect with you after today's episode, and what would be your call to action?
Okay, connecting with me, my email address is on my website, which is andrewleland.org. And I'm also occasionally on different social media that you could try to find me on. My website points to some of that. Call to action. I feel funny about like generalized calls for action, even though recognize that they're important. But I could try to summon a general call to action, which would be listen to people. I don't want to say like, call your senator. I probably should have something like that. But yeah, I think people, whatever side of the political spectrum, the disability spectrum, I think we get entrenched into our positions, and you don't have to agree with people, but I think like listening to people and understanding their position, even if it's a means to disagreeing with them and figuring out a way to, undo harm that you see other people doing. Like, I think it still requires paying pretty careful attention to what other people are thinking and saying and doing.
Yeah, and I'll add a call to action, which is to say, consume the book, get your hand on Andrew's book, read it, listen to it. Totally worth it. It's really good. And is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners, or anything that we didn't ask that we should have?
No, this has been super fun. Your questions were great, and I'm going to start listening to your podcast based on you, because you seem awesome, and I want to hear more.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's been a reflection of your energy. So, well, thanks so much for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you and getting to know you, and I hope you take care.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Adventures in Accessibility. Tune in next time for another dive into the unknown.
Adventures in Accessibility is hosted by Emily Schumann, and Jessica Lucinia is our sound engineer. This podcast is a project of the Rocky Mountain ADA Center and is funded under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, grant number 90DPAD0014. This production is intended solely for entertainment and informal guidance and should not be considered legal advice. The opinions expressed by guests are not necessarily held or endorsed by the Rocky Mountain ADA Center.